If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This episode is part of a series on the lies of productivity. When I say lie, I mean a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of what we're doing and how to best approach it. But these things are pushed at us so hard, and the challenges we face are so severe and growing that it feels like we're moving further and further away from what our situation actually should be. So I call them lies. In each of these episodes, I'll state a common belief about our work or our productivity, and then talk about the facts of why it just ain't so. A common quote attributed to Mark Twain, in error, probably, is, "It's not what you don't know that kills you, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So this series is an attempt to move through those misunderstandings. So once I've talked about what the common belief is, I'll talk about a more realistic mindset. And in most cases, practical steps to address the situation from that new mindset. So here we go. Let's start breaking down the lies. I'll say this one is maybe not so much of a lie as it is just a default mindset, but it qualifies under the same principles that we talked about before for lies. It's very, very common, almost a default mindset. And I want to talk about what that is. I'll identify it, and then we'll go from there. So the problem is this notion of busy. When we get busy, we have to think about what our default response to that is. And I'll say our typical default response is to work more hours. We all know the scenario here. We're humming along doing our thing, and then something happens. The boss shows up with a new project, new customer calls, something happens that implies that there's more work that we need to do. And then this new work just gets dumped in our laps. And when that happens, I think our default response is, oh, I'm going to put in more hours and I'm going to take this in, take it on board, and deliver on all these different things because I have no choice. Sometimes that's what we have to do, and we really have no choice. You know the drill. Call a spouse, let the kids know, whatever, that I'm not going to be able to meet the home commitments I was able to meet because I got busier. I got this new stuff. I'm not going to say that's an invalid approach. It's a valid approach. What we're doing is we're expanding our available work time beyond normal. We kill off all the non-work activities and, quote, burn the midnight oil. My fear is that this is more of an unthinking response, that it's a reaction instead of a thoughtful plan. I'm afraid we default to that because we don't feel like we have any options. We don't have any strategies about how to handle the situation. In this episode, I'm going to try and help with that. I'm going to try and give you some options that maybe will help you do busier right. So let's define our terms here. I'll say when we say we get busier, what that means is that we estimate that the amount of work, including the new thing, and the deadlines that that work involves means that we're going to need to do more hours of work in the near-term period of time than our typical schedule would permit, than what we've decided previously to do. Again, the scenario is real simple. You've got 5 things to do, and you figure that's going to take all week. And you've organized your work, and you're moving along with that. And then the boss or whoever your very important person is comes in and drops a new thing on your desk and says, well, that one's due Thursday. Well, holy cow, that piece of work is going to take me a whole day. And now there are 6 days worth of work, say nominally 48 hours worth of work, due in 5 days worth of week, 48 hours in a 40-hour available time. And we immediately do this math in our heads. We say, all the time is already filled up. I need more time. And then we go about the business of redoing our commitments and promises to those that are outside of our work sphere in order to bring this work on, this additional time on. So we reallocate our time in order to accommodate the additional work so that we can do 48 hours when we had only scheduled 40 hours. That default move of allocating more time to work and bringing that in from non-work is what I'm concerned about here. I think we need to have additional strategies and additional thoughts other than just automatically expanding our work time to take on this additional work. Holy cow, 4 days this week, I'm going to have to stay in the office until 7 to get this work done. And as I said, sometimes that's pretty much what has to happen. I think we don't spend enough time investigating the options. The challenge here is that in the long term, that default is not a sustainable habit. And I'll talk some about what that means later. But at a minimum, it's frustrating to us in the short term. We had our plan and we had our other things that we were going to do, and now all that's up in the air and we have to replan it. That's challenging to us. We know that we're renegotiating our commitments, and we're probably renegotiating our commitments with the most important people in our world. We have this feeling that we probably shouldn't be putting in this much time, but just that's the default. We look around and that's what other people do. That's certainly what the boss seems to expect. And so we just do it by default. So in this episode, we'll talk about some other strategies in the hope that you begin to see them as reasonable and viable alternatives. One of my big beliefs is that we have default behaviors because we don't have other scripts to follow. So I'll give you potentially other scripts to follow. And I'm going to talk about the mental approach and the mental shift. So I'll give you a different kind of mindset about this that you may want to adopt. The bottom line here, and I'll say this several times, always saying yes is not a reasonable solution. Expectations expand. People will take on your work and they'll be grateful for it. But that balance against people who would be grateful for your attention outside of work is important. You may be wondering about, and this is a common question that I see out there floating around, is how do you say no? And while I understand that no is not always an acceptable answer, we'll talk about how to do it better. And we'll also talk a little bit about what to do when you can't say no. I guess the point here is my strategy is not always saying no. I recognize that sometimes you have to say yes. I'll deal a little bit with ways to better manage the repercussions of saying yes. So there will be some practical strategies here. There's a long-term problem, and I'll talk about that just for a minute. The generic American employment understanding is really a challenging piece of work. The understanding, and it's usually not stated, tends to be, hey, you're the employee, so invest heavily in your job. And maybe after some period of time, the company will give you raises and promotions and perks and things like that. And I think both sides enter into this agreement by default. It's a cultural thing. I don't think anybody's trying to cheat anybody. I certainly think that a good company that you work for won't take advantage of the situation consistently. But it can't be this open-ended arrangement where you're constantly working 50 and 60 hours a week. If nothing else, the effort is there and the rewards are tenuous. There's not a clear agreement. It might be better if companies just directly paid us overtime, that they would have more discipline about working us overtime. But the employment contract, the assumed employment contract is what it is. And we all work under it unless we really make some efforts to do something different. you understand that contract and you behave accordingly. You want to be the number one employee, the employee of the month. And the phrase polishing the apple is applicable here because you don't know precisely the amount of effort that's going to be required to produce the rewards that you're seeking. I think it's a great goal to have. I think it's an honorable kind of goal because what you're actually trying to do is provide extra value versus your peers, supposedly. And then later, you're going to try and get some of that value back, get some value out of the additional value that you've produced in terms of a raise or a promotion or even bonus dollars at the end of the year. That's literally what we're talking about from an economic perspective. That's what this transaction looks like. But evaluating that over time is what I want us to take a look at. Over time, are we getting commensurate rewards with the commensurate effort that we're putting in? And this is a trade-off challenge. It's a challenge of self-management, looking into that as an act of self-management. If you've never been in business for yourself, customers are trying to extract as much value from you as they can, just like a lot of employers are. A customer mindset is a lot of times is trying to pay you as little as they can. And I think we all do this as customers. And usually in my case, I do this as a customer because my eyes are bigger than my budget. I'm trying to look for a deal that'll slide me into that new Mercedes when what I can actually afford is a Nissan. A lot of people just think they're just being sharp business people and getting a deal and saving a buck. But any number of ideas here. But the bottom line, at the end of the day, being a self-employed person really reinforces the lessons here of how much time do we devote for what kinds of rewards. And being a self-employed person moves us away from this assumed employee contract. It doesn't mean that we handle it perfectly, but it does mean that there's clearer assumptions, there's clearer requirements and clearer payments. And we get into the assumed employment contract and it gets vague. And really the only person that's going to take responsibility for your workload is you. And it really is a self-management challenge, a management of your own employment and career. And I think when I was an employee, I defaulted away from this management challenge. So you're either managing or failing to manage the bosses or the customers or the team's expectation around your work. Now, again, sometimes the actual correct decision is, well, I just got to get it done. I got to work this Saturday and there's nothing I can do about that. But if that's always the default, if that's always the decision, then I would have you recognize that you're setting up an agreement with whoever these very important people are. You're building an expectation of the amount of work that you'll get done consistently. And once you set that expectation, it's really, really hard to lower. So I had this experience in one of the software companies I managed and worked for. We'd get a new customer and everybody get really excited and yay, we got a new customer. And they'd be really enthusiastic about showing the customer that the customer had made a really good decision with coming along with our company. Quite frankly, the team of their own volition was working a fair amount of overtime to impress this customer. And it was a technical thing, and there's some contract nuances that had things going on. I won't bore you with that. But what wound up happening is that the team set the customer expectation of an amount of work that was going to get done per unit time, week or month or whatever it was at the time. And once you've set that expectation, it's really difficult to back away, whether it's with your boss or with your customers or with your team. It's very difficult to dial that back down. So we need to be thoughtful about it because at the end of the day, as I said before, very few people care about your time. Very few people care enough to help you deal with it and manage it effectively. I get it. People are concerned about this. If you're in business for yourself, you might fear losing a new customer by not polishing this apple and not showing out, showing up. But in the long term, and I understand this, I'm a solo business person and I understand what a new customer can do to your schedule. But you still have to make sure it's not just an automatic default. You have to manage yourself. You have to make sure that you're having a conversation with whoever it is. And that conversation doesn't have to be some big drama-filled catastrophe. You can have a reasonable conversation and avoid all that and have the conversation rationally and carefully. But you do need to have the conversation. And the more you have this conversation, two things are going to happen. The more you have it, the more people will expect it from you and accept it. I'm just being thoughtful about my work. I'm being thoughtful in managing myself. I'm not shirking. I'm not trying to run away and hide. I'm just being a responsible manager of my own situation. The second thing that'll happen is the more you have this conversation, the better you'll get at it. It's a practice session. You'll get better at talking about it. You'll reinforce your planning system and the value of doing the work that's going to be required. And we'll talk about that to have a planning system. But if you just say yes every time, then recognize that in the long term, you're setting yourself up for some pretty significant issues. You're sacrificing a lot of things that are rewarding to you, although not in dollar terms, for the one or few things that are rewarding to you in dollar terms. That can put in some challenges for you. We'll talk about that. Strategy number one is the planning strategy. When we're faced with this situation, the image that we want to give to our boss or our very important person is, hey, boss, I'm willing to do whatever it is you need done. But this means I'll be in the office on Saturday. Is that where we're at here? Is that what's necessary? So it's fair to say some version of that to the boss. The boss says, hey, here's this new work. We got to get it in. And it's okay to say, well, if that happens and nothing else changes, then I'll be in here on Saturday. Is that what's required in this case? Over the long term, if you just don't have that conversation, if you just accept the new work, then be prepared for that expectation to set, and you'll be doing it a lot more rather than managing your way out of it. If it's a repeating occurrence, you need to measure these things and track them as a good business person and a good manager of your own resource. But in the long term, you set an expectation, you're reinforcing a contract that you may not be interested in fulfilling. I'd say it's perfectly fair for you to reevaluate that from time to time. That's what business people do, is they get into contracts and they go, okay, well, the contract needs to renew. Are we going to do it the same way? Or are we going to renegotiate? In the current culture, we talk a lot about work-life balance and ideas around that, and there's several strategies around that. But the point is that as a knowledge worker, you've got to deal with that. You've got to be thinking about it and dealing with it on a regular basis because nobody else really is. And it's important because the employment contract is really fuzzy. It's assumed. It's cultural. We don't talk about it when we bring on a new job. We don't feel comfortable bringing up the notion of overtime as we're applying for a job because we think that'll eliminate us from consideration. But when you get a job and you begin to feel that culture, it's okay to evaluate that. And as I'm talking, white collar employees are beginning to push back against this assumed contract. They're beginning to evaluate it. I think that's a good thing. I think some people are taking a fairly irresponsible approach to that, but many people are doing it right. And they're beginning to have this conversation about, that assumed contract is really not where I'm at. It's not what I want to be involved in. Employees are saying, I need a job, but I need to deal with that job in the face of other things that I also need to do. Now, we have a long history of this, and I don't know where you are on unionization and federal regulation of the workforce and some of these sorts of ideas, but the initial effort at unionization was an effort to even the playing field because some employers were taking advantage of some employees. That's a two-way street. There have always been employees who take advantage of their employer and vice versa throughout the history of time. The unionization efforts, along with other kinds of, legislative efforts and those sorts of things, have put us where we are now. And white collar folks have gotten some benefit from that. I'll say it, the benefit from that has primarily affected more of the blue collar kind of work, more of the hourly payment kind of work. And white collar folks got some of the overflow benefits of that, but our employment contract is still really unclear. And I'm hammering this point, but I want you to understand that that vagueness is part of the problem here. But still, most people are much better off in the workforce now than people were 100 years ago. They were working these 72-hour weeks. Enough about that. Let's get to practical matters and what do I do when I get to work. I'll say that there's one precursor, there's one thing that you have to have in place in order to have this reasonable conversation dealing with this scenario. And there may be other things that need to be put in place in order to make this one thing happen, and we'll get to that. The one thing is, if it's not a work schedule per se, capital S schedule, where every minute is put in place, it's at least a prioritized list of the things that you plan to do over the next, intermediate period of time, over the next week or so. And you need to have a good sense of what the commitment is for each one of those things that you're trying to get to. So you need to have this prioritized list and some sense of, okay, altogether, this is about a week's worth of work or whatever that looks like for you. When this new work hits your desk, the first thing that you're going to want to do is to slide it in relative to the other things that are on your list. And we do this, I'll say we sort of do it, but we don't do it clearly. And it's important to do it clearly because that way you can talk about it clearly. You need to slot this new thing in relative to all the other things. Now, a note here, priority of tasks is almost never absolute. It's almost always relative to the other things that we've got going on in our world. Now, if we try to think of priority in terms of absolute priority, what happens eventually is we wind up with multiple number one priorities, so to speak. And it simply can't be true. You can't have multiple number one priorities. It takes some conversation and some thought and some planning, but the danger trap here is, here's these 6 number one priorities, take care of them. Because at the end of the day, it's just not helpful to do it that way. What I mean is there's no sense in having a priority system if everything is the number one priority. There's no sense in having a ranking system because you're not using it. 6 number one priorities is just chaos, and it's difficult to plan. It's difficult to react well in that scenario. We've talked about a couple of general ideas. First, the employment contract, which in many ways seems to fall in favor of the employer. And second, the need for some plan that you can refer to, because one, priority is almost always relative, and two, you want to be able to slot this work in at its correct priority level. Now we'll talk about strategies here. Strategy one is to negotiate the new commitment with your boss. The boss says, I've got 8 new hours of work for you to do. Let's get it done by Thursday. It's possible to negotiate this commitment with your boss, and I'm going to tell you how so that you believe that it's possible and begin to integrate this thinking into your own workplace. When we think about this new work, we think, okay, I've thought through what I'm doing, and here's the 5 or 6 things that I had planned to occupy my week. Okay, boss, I need your help to replan this work. I'm willing to do whatever's necessary, but I just want us to think through where this fits in so that I can then manage my time most effectively. And this conversation is a doable thing. It depends some on what your work culture is, but it definitely depends on you having a pretty precise and specific list of things that you plan to do. If you have this list of work items in priority order, then the conversation can go something like this. Hey, boss, thanks for letting me know about this new work. Can you help me think about it? Now, here it's very important, and you got to be able to pull this up in seconds because it's going to make the conversation flow. You need some way to show what your list is. You need some way to present that list. It doesn't have to be on a piece of paper. You can show a computer screen or whatever it is. You can even do it verbally. What you don't want to do is to pull this list off the top of your head because you're in a somewhat stressful conversation and your brain's not working terribly well. And you don't want to have to be drumming up your to-do list because you'll sound uncertain. You'll sound like you haven't really planned, but you're pretending to plan. It'll go much better if you have a list and that list is already structured. So if you have it, you bring it up, and here's how this conversation goes. Hey, boss, my current number one is here. The deadline is Tuesday. Let's look at this new thing. Is this new thing a higher priority than that? Well, yes or no. And you really want to push for a clear answer at this point because a mushy answer just doesn't help you. Right? You're trying to get help from your boss and well, I'm not sure. And but what you can't do is compare this one thing to a pile of unorganized stuff. And so that's why we want to have this list. So the boss says there's two scenarios, yes and no. We'll deal with the yes scenario first. So the boss says, yep, it's a higher priority than your number one. So then you add it into your top slot, but you don't stop there. And stopping here is a pretty common error, even for people that engage in this conversation. And what's actually happening here is we're making the assumption that when the boss says, yes, this is more important than number one on your list, we're making the assumption that the boss automatically understands that it's going to affect the entire list. If we make this assumption, then we put it on there, move on, get started. But there's no real reason to believe that the boss understands your work at that level. And that's why you have the list. You're going to eventually move down to the bottom of the list, and we'll talk about how to do that in a minute. But just recognize that when the boss says, yes, this is priority number one, it supersedes everything else, you're not quite done with the conversation. So now let's address the other side. You say, hey, boss, here's my number one priority. Here's this new thing. Is it the new thing more important than number one? And you can see how having a list and being ready to pull it out at any time is the most useful way to have this conversation. But you say, here's number one, here's the new thing. Is the new thing more important than number one? And your boss says, no, it isn't. Well, here's where the structured list comes into play, because then you go to number two. And you say, okay, is the new thing more important, higher priority than number two? The boss says yes or no, but you're able to slot it into your list in the appropriate place. And it's only really doable if you have this list and you slot the thing in where it belongs. But again, you can't stop here. There's more conversation, and it's the same as I referred to on the yes side. Again, if we just stop the conversation there, we're assuming that the boss knows the impact of this all the way down our list, and that's not a great assumption. But we'll get to that in just a second. So the third case is sometimes this conversation results in the boss saying, the new thing is below the lowest thing on your list, right? You got 6 things on your list, and this turns out to be number 7. So you've checked it against number 1, number 2, number 3, and then you find out, well, this is on the bottom of the list. Okay, well, the answer is put it in at the bottom of the list. You can't just ignore it because your boss is not ignoring it. And you need to track it just like everything else you're doing. And you don't want to forget about it, which is why you track it. So we'll talk about why that is later. The reason that the boss brought it to you is that it's on his or her mind, and they simply want to make sure it's dealt with somehow. One of the underlying things the boss wants is to not forget about this work, and it's on their mind. So they're going, oh, okay, who needs to do it? And they're coming to you and wanting you to keep track of it. The trap here is that if you just forget about it, then over time, the boss is going to recognize that and they're going to artificially inflate its priority to make sure it gets on your list. Because over time, if we go through this exercise and you go, oh, well, it's not on my list. Okay, thanks, boss. And then you never refer back to this work item, then eventually the boss is going to wise up to this and they're going to give it artificially high priority just so it gets your attention and keeps your attention. That's a challenge you've got to deal with. Through any of the three scenarios, we've now made it to the point where there are no longer 6 things on your list. There are now 7 things on your list. And we got here by slotting the new thing in where it belongs in order of priority, whether that's number 1, number 4, or number 7. So now we got to talk about the implications of that decision. So the first thing you want to do is arrive at an estimate of how long the new thing's going to take. It's probably best to just take a few minutes and consider that and consider the whole list with that new information. And you may be able to say, hey, boss, it's going to take a few minutes to plan around this and get back to you. Maybe you can do that. Maybe you can't. Boss is probably in a hurry and may not want to have to take time to schedule another conversation about this. So you may not have time to plan and you'll have to do it in real time and you'll have to come up with a spot estimate of how much time this new thing's going to take. Regardless of how you got here, you've now got 7 things on your list. So what you do is you then move to the bottom of the list and start talking about what might be able to come off the list. This conversation is, okay, you gave me this new information, but to me, it looks like number 7 doesn't fit into this week's work. Is that okay? Can we push that to next week? I'm a good team member. I'm willing to do what it takes, but I only want to do what's necessary. And if it's necessary, I'll do that. But I just want to make sure that that's where we are with this new information. At this point, the boss may ask you a challenging question, which is, well, when will number 7 get done? If it's not going to get done this week, when will it get done? At this point, you pretty much have to say, well, that's going to require me to go through another planning session, but I can tell you it's not going to get done this week. Is that okay? Or it's not going to get done in the next 5 work days. Is that okay? The boss says, yes, that's okay. Or the boss says, no, that's not okay. I see your list and yes, we're just going to have to put in some overtime on it. Then in a positive or negative sense, you've solved your problem. But if the boss says, well, we've just got to get to it, we've got to fit it in somewhere, then you may have the opportunity to say, okay, well, what does it look like if this happens next week? But I want you to notice where you've gotten. You're having a reasonable, low emotion, no drama conversation with your boss about your priorities and about the needed amount of effort this week. So congratulations on that. That's a far different place than just, yeah, I'll do it. I got to do it, blah, blah, blah. Congratulations. This conversation is the first tactic in this scenario. And you see now why it's important to have this prioritized list and why it's important to keep it up to date and to have it ready on the spur of the moment, because these things happen quickly. And if you're not prepared for it, then you wind up not being able to have the conversation well. And then the default is, yeah, well, let's just get it done and then we won't have to worry about it anymore. Hopefully that helps you have these reasonable conversations and avoid this untenable long-term situation. Now, I will take a minute and say, I firmly believe that it's all work. It's all effort put forth to try and make yourself or your environment into what you want it to be. Some stuff pays you in dollars and you get paid in other ways for other kinds of effort. If you're going to manage yourself, if you're going to manage your attention, then you're going to have to manage competing demands. And you got to face these trade-offs. We can't just whine and complain about it because you do have options. But think about really spending some time and some mental effort consistently examining what's going on in this world, what this balance is. And this is the way to achieve the notion of work-life balance, is to really examine what your rewards are, what you're having to give to get those rewards, and balance it from that perspective. Otherwise, you get into this non-sustainable situation where you're just always over busy. We've talked about scenario one, where when you get busy, you need to have this list of your planned work so that you can have the conversation that we just talked about. Learning how to have that conversation is critical, and consistently supporting that conversation by having your list in place. And the best way to learn to do that is to start trying. Strategy two. Oops, here we are. We're in this situation. It's overtime time. Are there tactics and strategies for getting it all done? And I would say, yeah, there are, and we'll talk with a few. And again, in scenario two here, where we just got to get it all done, there's a precursor, and we'll talk about what that is. So scenario two comes into play when it really is an emergency. You've had the conversation and it's just time to suck it up and go. Or for whatever reason, you're not able to have that conversation with your boss, and it may be habit or it may be culture or whatever reason. But note here, you're not in control of your own tasks and attention. If you're not having the conversation, start having this conversation, start practicing. Okay, it may not get you the results that you want, but you'll learn over time both how to do it and what the implications are. So nope, it's all got to get done. It's all due Friday. You know how our business is. We can't turn down customers. In that case, the first thing you need to do is your own replanning. You got to do your own reallocation plan, reallocation of your attention and effort towards this list of things. And don't just default to shortchanging your relationships outside of work. Stop and think about this for a few minutes, because in my managerial roles, I've been in a situation where I did exactly that. I didn't think about it and just assumed there was no choice. And then over time, my status quo was that I was working a fair amount of overtime, this 50 and 60 hour a week situation. And that gets unsustainable. Other people start pushing back and demanding your time. So you need to sit down and replan and think about your tactics for this pile of work, because you do want to get it done in the most reasonable amount of time possible. You don't want to just spend 80 hours in the office, because that's bad. So let's talk about tactic one. There's a couple ways to think about this whole list, but tactic one is manage your own expectation of quality around these different work items. It might be that one of the things on your existing list was a project that you really thought you'd show out with and really impress people with and really put a gold star on the promotion list with. So you'd allocated a bunch of time to it. The key is to notice that you could get a reasonable result for some smaller amount of effort and attention than what you initially thought it was going to take. And that's okay. I've said this before, the whole notion of quality is a chimera. It's an illusion. For knowledge workers particularly, everything is a best effort kind of agreement. And what I mean by that is do the best you can given the circumstances. As knowledge workers, our jobs are not well enough defined for anybody to say, hey, boss, I'm going to have to go from 500 lug nuts this week to 400 lug nuts. Instead, we need to rethink the goals of each of the deliverables in our stack. And that can be very helpful in this scenario. Certainly, you always want to deliver a reasonable, solid output. Don't hear me say that you should be slacking. And it's so funny because in the American work culture, it's even hard to talk about this. Oh, you've always got to give 100%. And some people would say, well, I'm going to give 110%. Well, the joke here is first give 110% in math class, and then we'll figure out how you're going to produce 110% here. But that's whatever 100% means, that's the work culture that we're in. And so it's hard to even talk about strategically lowering the quality of our output. But here's the reality. In the crunch time, you either manage quality or you fall prey to the demands of the clock. It's one or the other. And what I mean is that if you don't plan you'll wind up cutting corners on different things for different reasons. Mostly you'll wind up sacrificing quality to the deadlines. It's much better to take a strategic look, to plan, and to decide then what your quality targets are. So otherwise the scenario is number 7, get short shift, and you're tired and you've worked a long week and you're not controlling the level of quality. So thinking about that in advance. So take a look at all the deliverables for all the tasks that are on your plate now. Are all of the deliverables necessary? Did you assume that something had to be done along with all of these facets and nuances of it? Are there some of your tasks that you could just turn in a draft, so to speak, some intermediate product, and then your stakeholders can move their thing along while you may be fixing it? Hey, here's my idea. Here's what I think about this. I've got some more detailed data to get to you later, but for now, this is where I'm headed with this. So y'all can go ahead and start doing your work. The key to the replanning is you're taking a minute to assess your assumptions about the situation. Now, your assumptions may be true. On the other hand, your assumptions may be false. If so, then you can take advantage of that, fix them now, and shorten the amount of effort, lower the amount of effort and attention that each one of these things might take. But it's worth taking a few minutes to look into that. First tactic, we're in the scenario where, yeah, it's overtime. So the first tactic is to back up and replan and take a serious look at quality and deliverables. The second tactic is to renegotiate commitments that you have with other stakeholders. Now, again, this is something that happens naturally. This is what happens when we go to our spouse or significant other and say, hey, I'm working late tonight. Don't cook dinner for me. I know you were expecting me, but don't do that anymore. So what we're actually doing is we're doing a knee-jerk renegotiation with a specific external stakeholder. We've had the negotiation with our boss and that didn't turn out our way. So we go to somebody else and we say, okay, you're going to have to take up the slack here. Well, my point throughout all this is to stop and think for a second, is that really what needs to happen? I think one of the mistakes that we make is we habitually prioritize one stakeholder over another. We habitually prioritize, say, our job over our relationships with our significant others. And sometimes it needs to be the other way around. What you'll find is that many customers can be amenable to this kind of discussion. And you might say something like, hey, in order to give this my best attention, the deliverable is going to have to be a week from Friday. Is that okay? What does that do to your time, to your schedule? You may get any kind of answer, but you at least want to think it through and not default to banging on your significant other every time this situation pops up, because it's not fair. And in the long term, it's going to be hard. So again, back to the notion that it's all work. It's all commitments that we've made. It's all things that need to happen. When people talk about work-life balance, they tend to think about work, which is making money, versus life, which is everything else. And a lot of us, because we're Americans, think that work always trumps not work. But if we think about it in these binary categories, there's no nuance there. There's no flexibility. And I'm speaking from experience. At one point in my life, it was always my wife that took the beating. It was always my relationship with her that got sacrificed in order to get the work done. And that caused me problems in the long term. And I'd like to help you avoid that pain. So you may need to broaden your options on which outside stakeholder you need to be negotiating with on this situation. We mostly considered this in the first scenario, but it might be helpful to add detail. Check your planned list for things that your boss may be less interested in. Take a look for work that you might actually be doing for other people or other parts of the organization. And this is one of the best reasons for your prioritized list to include all of your tasks, whether for life or for work. If your list includes all of your commitments, then it's easier to more precisely identify who's being impacted and what your options actually are. I'll say a lot about this elsewhere, so I won't push it too much here. And you certainly don't, when you're having this negotiation with your boss, you certainly don't necessarily want to pull in your quote, personal, unquote work into this discussion. But just make sure that you're considering all of your work and all of your time. Maybe you can plan to skip the staff meetings this week and get the boss's permission to do that. That'll help you buy back some time. Maybe you can work from home this week and avoid the commute, and that'll buy you back some time. Maybe you can get your boss's help and get them to reassign work to somebody else. Take something off your list and put it on somebody else's. But think about that and present these options. So that's the second tactic. And we want to be real careful with that negotiation. But the real underlying point is we have to manage those trade-offs. We can't outsource this management piece, and just burying our head in the sand is not a good idea in the long. We have to face up the fact that we're responsible for these trade-offs. And we're the only one really that can make that trade-off happen. Becoming a solid manager of our own attention and effort. Well, that's two tactics. Tactic 3 is to shorten the time horizon for your planning. Now, don't hear me say something I'm not saying. Shortening your time horizon is not an exercise in procrastination. There's actually a tactic you can use here that'll help you, and the tactic is time boxing. I've talked a good bit about this in other places. Time boxing is recognizing that you've only got X amount of resources. In this case, the resource we're talking about is time, to apply to each task on this list or to solving this problem. Time boxing is approaching your work and saying, realistically, I can only spend 2 hours on this. I've got to focus. And this is one of the great things about time boxing. You'll be shocked. If you challenge yourself, you'll be shocked at how much your focus improves when you're doing the task. You'll be shocked at how productive you can be when you really commit to a time box and you focus tightly on what it is you need to do during that period of time. So challenge yourself. Say to yourself, okay, I've only got 2 hours to complete this. And mentally stick to that 2 hours. Make sure that you're making that time count. You want to maximize the output of those 2 hours. I'll say here from a mental perspective, one of the things that really hampers our productivity is what we think about tasks and what we tell ourselves. We say, oh, I hate doing this, or I'm mad at having to work overtime. Well, fine. But what is it you're hating? You're doing work sitting in a comfortable chair with a beverage close to hand. What is it you're hating? Think carefully about that. And don't just default to a poor mindset. I've done an episode elsewhere about how our mindset affects our ability to work, so I won't beat this to death here. But if you're constantly saying, oh, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, that's mental energy that you could be using to focus on the task instead and actually get things done. Just a note for that. Anyway, back to this time boxing. Challenge yourself. I'm going to ship this after 2 hours of effort, and your brain will really kick into gear. And there's something about our psychology that helps us do that, and I don't have any science to back that up, but it is experience. I'm never an advocate of doing poor work. Don't ever hear me say that. But I'm also not an advocate of seeking perfection. And I've talked about this elsewhere. If your goal is perfection, you're doomed to disappointment, because we don't know what perfection is. We can't measure it, we can't manage it, and if we could, our stakeholders couldn't afford it. Time boxing has this amazing ability to get your focus where it needs to be, to get thinking about, does this actually need to be in? Does this section actually need to be here? And it also helps you think of ways to streamline the task. It helps you think about your work process. So it's a great thing. Time boxing is tactic 3. And it's terribly useful. I'm presenting it in the case of this single scenario, but actually time boxing really should be the norm for us. We should constantly be challenging ourselves to focus tightly, get the work done, and deliver it. Because putting tasks down and picking them back up is very expensive. And I've talked about this a lot in other areas. We're in crunch time, and I've given you 3 tactics to consider when this scenario presents itself. The first tactic is to manage quality of your deliverables. The second is to look for other outside stakeholders who can, from time to time, take the burden of this problem that you've got. Don't just assume that it's work versus life, and life always takes the beating. Think through it, plan it. And the third tactic is time boxing. I can't overemphasize the value of practicing that and learning how to do it. Underlying both scenarios, and really the viability of the 3 tactics in the second scenario, is I need this list. How do I have this list? And it's critical. You're going to have tough sledding on making your own trade-off decisions if you don't have the list. You're going to have a tough time having the conversation with the boss if you don't have the list. This list, and we call it a backlog, is a cornerstone of Attention Compass and an Attention Compass implementation. So we set up a strong tool to help you manage all this information in your backlog. In fact, when I talk about the 4 workflows in Attention Compass, 3 and most of 3.5 of them are workflows, and they're habits around how to best manage that backlog. Okay, and that's important because a well-managed backlog automatically produces consistently this list of things that you'll need to have when this scenario presents itself. And all these workflows are about how to get stuff on the backlog, what to do with it while it's there, and how to keep that backlog in good shape over time so that you've always got it. One of the key points here is whether you're an employee or not, you have to manage your tasks. There's more to what you can dream of doing than there is possibly time to get it done. So a key is you've got to track decisions about what you've decided to do later. And we talked a little bit about that earlier, but that's very important. The whole point of this post is that your boss used to manage your task list much more aggressively than your boss is able and willing to do now. So you have to manage your own backlog with input from your boss. You've got to take control of it and be in charge of it with input from your boss. And to be fair, input from your other stakeholders as well. Even if you're an employee, you need to be active about this stuff. And it's not just managing work versus non-work, but about having more nuanced categories than that. So a little plug for Attention Compass there. And that's really its goal, is that you consistently have this list that you're able to pull out at a moment's notice anytime you need to replan, whether it involves another stakeholder or just yourself making these trade-offs. To recap, make sure you always have a well-defined and organized list of what you're doing right now. Make sure you know what the scenario you face is, whether it's scenario 1, where we can negotiate and lower the amount of work that needs to be done in the time period, or whether it's scenario 2 and you're just going to have to kick in the overtime. For this understanding, you'll need to have a conversation with your boss. So if scenario 1 works out, then you've solved your problem. And you've reinforced for yourself the value of your list. So don't sweep that under the rug. It's a solid win. You should congratulate yourself. You're moving forward in managing yourself and your work. There are going to be times when you fall into scenario 2. It's tough, but now you have some tactics to approach it. Remember to take a few minutes to replan and figure out ways for your boss to help you, if at all possible. Don't just assume anything, and particularly don't assume that you're on your own. The tactics, think about the quality of the deliverables. Good management is knowing when to make trade-offs. And this may be a time where you need to practice doing that. Analyze your other commitments, but be careful about not consistently deprioritizing a particular stakeholder. That in the long term can cost you relationships and present huge challenges in your life. And the third tactic, engage in time boxing and using time commitments. Set a timer. Okay. watch the clock. I got to get this done in 2 hours. Your brain will kick in and help you do that. So challenge yourself. Maybe even when it's not crunch time, you should consider challenging yourself and minimizing the amount of time that it takes. There's this notion that work expands to fill the available time. I don't know whether that's been proven or not. But if you take the opportunity to try and squeeze it down, try and focus your attention and use focused attention as a trade-off for additional time. Practice doing that. I think what you'll find is that you can get better or faster at producing other kinds of work when you have the opportunity to practice that. So finally, let's think about one important thing. This is an episode in your world. It's going to be a fairly short duration. You're not going to live here forever. And so when the dust settles, take another look at what's going on. Figure out how to talk to your stakeholders about expectations. Actually take some time to plan this conversation. Take some time to prepare your list for this conversation, even if you're not sure you're going to need it. And practice these ideas. And I think you'll find that you get better at your work over time. If your boss is consistently putting you in scenario 2, plan a conversation about it. It'll be a tough conversation. You'll want to use good conversational tactics, and you'll want to not be afraid to have the conversation. But don't let the opportunity go. Maybe you can negotiate a way to spend less time in scenario 2. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.